you for coming. My name is Tom Mikkelsen, President and Scientific Director of the Ontario Brain Institute. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon to OBI's public talk, the first in a while, a hybrid presentation on precision medicine, the future of brain health. Today is a hybrid event with in-person and online audiences. But before we begin, I wanted to acknowledge that some of us are gathered here today for the first time since 2020. And we're on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So this meeting place is still home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples who remain caregivers of the land. We're grateful to have the opportunity to live and work here. So OBI, just for those that don't know, we're a provincially funded non-for-profit. We work to accelerate the discovery and innovation benefiting patients and the economy. We're founded in 2010, and the vision is to position Ontario as a world leader in brain research, commercialization, and care. Our mission is to improve the lives of folks. The 1 in 3 Canadians are impacted by a brain disorder. Over the last 8 years, we've hosted over 30 public talks featuring experts in neuroscience and brain health. These conversations, of course, are meant to educate, inform, and empower you with knowledge about brain health, drawing from the latest advances in research and care. Today's talk, which I'm going to moderate, will explore the concept of precision medicine in brain health, which is a number of buzzwords, but and importantly, we'll hear from experts about what that conception looks like. We're going to talk about research discoveries that move us closer to individualized treatments regarding brain health. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. We have just about over an hour this evening. And as moderator, I'm going to facilitate about a 45 to 50-minute chat with our panelists, and after that, we'll take audience questions. So for those of you watching on the live stream, do send us your questions, and you can use the chat function on the right side of the screen, or you can email us at communications@braininstitute.ca. For those of you here in the room, when you have a question, please raise your hand. We have volunteers that are going to pass you a paper and pen, and please hand it back so we'll coordinate the flow of questions. And you can also email the same email address. So let me begin by introducing our panelists. First of all, we have Dr. Andrée-Anne Ledoux, who is a scientist at the CHIO Research Institute, assistant professor in Department of Cellular and Molecular Medicine at the School of Psychology at the University of Ottawa. Andrée-Anne's research interests include the development of novel approaches for the assessment, treatment, and understanding of concussion and mental health. Dr. Azadeh Kushki, who is a senior scientist at the Holland Bloorview Kids Rehab Hospital here in Toronto, is an associate professor at the Institute of Biomedical Engineering at the University of Toronto. Azadeh's research focuses on the application of data science and approaches to characterize the neurodevelopmental diversity and to develop technology-based supports for neurodivergent children. And Dr. Peter Szatmari, professor at the Department of Psychiatry at the Szatmari Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto, and senior scientist at the Hospital for Sick Children. Peter's worked in the field of child and youth psychiatry for over 40 years in the areas of ADHD, disruptive behavior disorders, depression and anxiety, and impairment due to mental disorders. He's currently the director of the Kundal Center for Child and Youth Depression at the CAMH and co-lead of the Precision Child and Youth Mental Health Initiative at the Hospital for Sick Kids. In 2021, he was also elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada for his contributions for mental health. So I'm going to take my seat and kick off the discussion. All right, so if the mic works, we're going to start off, and I'd like to start with Peter. We've spoken about the term precision medicine, not being quite right for the involved with youth mental health, but you've said that you prefer personalized mental health. What's the difference?
So let me take a step back and make sure folks understand that most of the time we choose an intervention for a mental health condition based on the diagnosis. So a kid with ADHD would get one intervention, a kid with anxiety disorder might get another, with depression another. And for the most part that works reasonably well, but we know that about 40% of kids in each of those categories won't respond to first-line evidence-based treatments. And so The concept of precision mental health or personalized mental health is to try and understand what individual characteristics we can leverage about each unique kid in order to improve the percentage of kids who have a good outcome. Now, the meaning of precision medicine comes from cancer, where it's been very successful, and it relies on two innovative characteristics. One is the new availability of big data, so genomic data, protein data, microbiome data, and using that data with machine learning, the second innovation, to try and identify characteristics of individual kids that would push you towards one intervention or another. My feeling is that this is a dream, it's an aspiration, more than a reality at the moment, which is why I like personalizing the intervention and using that term. But I hope one day it'll be precise.
For sure. Certainly the generation of evidence in populations of kids who don't really have the same disorder must be very difficult. So I think the constellation or the spectrum disorders of how you define what a diagnosis is complex.
I mean, the individual variation within kids who have a single diagnosis, whether it's ADHD or autism or depression, is enormous. Like, kids just vary enormously. And for the most part, we don't take account of that variation to personalize the intervention. And we need to do that. We need to do research to find out what's the key, what's the, what will unlock a better outcome based on whatever characteristic we want to look at.
As they say, if you've seen one child with autism, you've seen one child with autism.
That's what Leo Kanner said.
Right,
Exactly.
So there is no blood test for that. So I think that also speaks to the fact that the populations need to be studied in a clinical trial setting to learn and use big data to define those categories. That'll be important. Terrific. So Azadeh, your research focuses on supporting neurodivergent kids based on the strengths and needs rather than interventions based on specific diagnoses, which I've just finished saying maybe not perfectly appropriate all the time. How does this relate to precision health? And how does it bring us closer to specific treatments for kids?
Right. So as Peter mentioned, there's a lot of variability within the same diagnosis label. So a label like autism or ADHD is a broad label, and we see variability at different, this variability is very multidimensional, and we see this in terms of the biology, as Peter mentioned, we see this in terms of the behavioral and clinical presentation, and we see it in terms of the experiences of distress and disability. So my research focuses on understanding this variability at the brain level. So we look at features of the brain, like the brain structure, brain connectivity, and brain function, and look to see if there are groups of kids who share similar characteristics. So we've been working with data from the Province of Ontario Neurodevelopmental Disorders Network, or POND, to answer some of these questions. And basically what we did was we basically said, let's look at the brains and the brain patterns and forget about the diagnoses and look for similarities between kids. So we found groups of kids who had similar brain patterns, and this could be brain structure features or function or connectivity. And then we'll look to see if these groups of similar characteristics, if kids share diagnostic labels. And the answer was no. We actually had kids with and without diagnoses of neurodevelopmental conditions in those different groups. So this goes to what Peter was saying in terms of then how do we translate this into developing targeted interventions that can be meaningful for kids? So basically the work that we do is looking to understand this variability and understanding how that variability then maps onto the experiences of disability, distress, and response to various interventions and supports.
Terrific. So defining that spectrum of disorders. Terrific. Andrée-Anne, some concussion and traumatic brain injury researchers are looking to precision medicine for things like biomarkers that might guide prediction of outcomes, but others are looking more toward the larger precision health strategies, including prevention. What is the potential for the identification for biomarkers in outcomes for related to concussion?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Tom. So first of all, precision medicine and precision health is very in its infancy right now in concussion, but researchers are starting to investigate how to best predict outcomes or more severe outcomes after a concussion, and how to best manage these outcomes afterwards. Now, finding that one biomarker to try to do this is very hard and has been very challenging. And we have, just because a concussion is so complex and so unique, everybody has a different mechanism of injury, for instance. And so we have learned over the past years that it is not just one biomarker that we do need to look into, but we need to look, as Peter was saying, we need to look into a multitude of markers. And I note that I have removed the word bio. And so markers such as personal characteristics, symptoms, but psychosocial symptoms as well, or just psychosocial characteristics, and as well biology of the patients, and try to put together all these variables together to try to predict who will go on having more severe outcome after a concussion.
So this is like a risk signature.
So this is like a risk signature. So in 2016, there was a team at CHIO, which was led by Roger Zemek, who conducted this large pan-Canadian study with over 3,000 children. And what he discovered is called the 5P rule. And this 5P rule contains 9 variables based on certain personal characteristics, for instance, age, sex, history of migraine, history of previous concussion, and a lot of symptoms upon presentation. And when they put in these variables into an algorithm, they discovered that their algorithm was actually 68% accurate at indicating whether a patient would go on having more severe symptoms, or what we call persistent post-concussive symptoms, at 4 weeks post-injury. But I think what we need to know is, the accuracy is only 68%. We need to start doing better. And I really do think that with big data, with precision medicine, we will be able to capture those biomarkers and those psychosocial markers to be able to add into that same algorithm to better predict those that go on having concussion.
Given the diversity of folks that are suffering concussions and their backgrounds, and then the diversity in actually the mechanism of injury, it stands to reason, in fact, that the outcomes would be difficult to predict. Surely the improvement in accuracy has to come from large-scale deployment of rules like that in routine clinical care, and again, big data towards the interrogation of folks over time as part of their routine care. It's kind of a continuous process improvement for refining rules and improving upon rules.
It is a refining process, and it's a refining process that takes loads of data and loads of patients with concussion, large networks or large learning systems that are required with multi-clinics, giving their data to those large learning systems for us to be able to take this data and analyze it to try to make these predictive.
And 5P has been deployed in some clinical networks going forward with ongoing
data
gathering.
The 5P rule has been deployed across Canada, and I believe in pretty much all the emergency departments, pediatric emergency department. Just to note, the 5P rule is only for pediatrics right now, from 5 to 18, but the goal is to obviously make a similar algorithm for adults and test it and see if it's accurate as well.
Sure, absolutely. And I think it's a good intersection between the big data and the pragmatics of real-world care treatment and kind of continuous process improvement. So that's very encouraging. I did want to encourage the participants online or in the room here to please send us the questions. You're going to use that chat function on the right side of the screen, or email us at communications@braininstitute.ca so we can start to move towards some of those audience questions. Thank you. So the first is, maybe let's throw it up and see who wants to answer. How do you think precision medicine will positively impact the treatment of youth brain disease and mental illness? Maybe, Peter, I'll start with you.
How will it?
Yeah. How do you think precision medicine will positively impact care?
Yeah, so to be fair, I'm not 100% sure it will.
Okay.
Because I worry that we'll be barking up a whole bunch of wrong trees. So part of what we need to think through very carefully is which are the trees we should be trying to climb in order to do this. And I think, let me give an example of sleep. Sleep's a biomarker, and we have some good evidence that kids who can't sleep are at higher risk of developing depression. So with the use of wearables, we can identify kids who are sleeping poorly before their mood gets worse, before their mood deteriorates, and we might be able to intervene and we have some really good interventions for insomnia. We might be able to intervene with those kids so that it prevents the development of depression later on. and it might prevent the recurrence of depression as a second episode. Activity is another example. Activity level, it may be another biomarker where we can predict kids who are at risk of developing depression, so low levels of activity, not talking on their cell phone, sort of being isolated, or kids who have very high levels of activity and are agitated. And there's some evidence that these changes in activity level occur prior to the development of worsening of their mood. So that's just an example of how wearables seem to be a practical, at least in my view, way of either preventing or ensuring that the next episode of a mental health disorder doesn't get worse, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my hope.
So let's drill down on that a little bit. You did mention wearables. Perhaps we could turn to the engineer and talk a little bit about what do we mean by wearables and what is the range of possible technical ways of acquiring data types that might be informative. Azadeh?
For sure. So I think in my experience, wearables would be any sort of device that can be worn on the body in a way that they can be mobile and go with a person in their everyday environments. So an example of that would be a smartwatch that many of us wear. We may or may not be aware that these watches are actually collecting a multitude
You don't think anybody's aware we're not being tracked?
That's right. A multitude of information about us, anything from the locations that we visit, to our heart rate, to our activity levels, to our sleep. And all of this information can be used to make a lot of conclusions about what it is that we're doing. So the other day, for example, I sat in my car and somehow my phone knew where I was going based on the pattern of that particular week. So there's a lot of personalization that can happen with these types of wearables. I think there's a lot of exciting advances that are happening with devices that can be that can collect other types of information, like, for example, mobile brain imaging technologies, which are probably a few years down the line, but they're coming. And they can start to collect information about health and biology.
Yeah, I think the idea is modeling a patient's journey with their disorder over time by data. Andrée-Anne, the other term that Peter brought up was a biomarker, and you talked about biomarkers including a signature like 5P. What do you think of as a definition of a biomarker?
A definition of a biomarker? Definition of a biomarker would be a biological fluid or anything that's biological that our body would produce that we're capable of collecting, either saliva, blood. We can analyze and understand whether a person, for instance, would have a concussion or not. So it would be an assay, if we want to call it that way. So it can be a biological signature from our brain, a biological signature from our saliva, from our blood. Especially in concussion right now, we are starting to look really more into biological signatures of the saliva for microDNA, for instance, and in blood as well. And within the brain, it could be easily connectivity differences, which we're starting to see as well in concussion, where we do have functional connectivity differences. So that could be easily a biological marker as well.
Right. So obviously portable imaging is a long way off, but imaging is really the gold standard for looking at brain structure, but it is not commonly recognized. In fact, you can almost do brain biopsy by liquid biopsy, by blood tests. There are, for example, markers that might indicate the extent of injury in the brain, neurofilament light chain, for example. And that's both in acute injury like concussion, but also potentially in diseases like neurodegeneration.
Exactly, but we're only starting to see them right in concussion. We're still in infancy, and neurofilament light has not been yet. I think there's like a second generation of the neurofilament light that is starting to be researched that might be a bit more predictive or indicative if someone has a concussion.
I think the lesson, though, is that whatever technology is being deployed in the real world, this validation in a going forward way in new patients in the real world is so critical. To measure the impact and the value. All right, the next question from the audience: what advice would you give to clinicians on how to integrate precision medicine strategies to improve patient care? Just throw that up there.
Listen.
Oh, good.
Listen. I find that young people today, when we train them, they spend a lot of time making a diagnosis, and that's the end of the story. And they say, okay, kid's got ADHD, I know what to do,
You've got your
stimulant
label.
medication, that's the end of story, thank you very much. And I think that that doesn't capture the complexity of that kid, the predicament that the kid lives in, the social determinants of health. And I think we need to not only have a diagnosis, but each kid has a story. And we have to listen to that story, and we have to help that kid and that family construct that story so it starts to make sense. And sometimes listening and collecting all this different information is what we need in order to make stories to share with our patients. And I think in that way, we can sort of improve their outcomes, their engagement with treatment, make sure that they, stay in treatment and benefit from it.
So I think the lesson is not all about the science and the biology, it's the social context as well. Certainly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, terrific. Any comments there? So it does lead into this next question, in fact, and this is for Azadeh. Does the reclassification of the neurodevelopmental disorders, does it bring it closer to personalization, personalized strategies for care? What's your initial take on that? We talked about the fact that two children with autism, although they may share the same diagnostic category, they might be completely different than one another. And how does the reclassification potentially help? First of all, how might that be done? How might you reclassify or define diagnostic categories away from the labels that we have now, which are inadequate, shall we say?
So there's a lot in that that needs to be unpacked. I think just to answer the second question first, how would we go about doing that? So the work that we're doing with POND looks specifically at the biology piece, right? So we can say we have these group of kids who have similar biologies, and then you can do that at different levels. You can do that at the level of genetics or brain or phenotype. But as you mentioned, there are many other factors that impact these experiences of distress and disability in real life, socio-demographic context being a really important one. So I think we are still ways away from being able to say, these are the groupings that definitively will tell you what kids need. But I think what we do have right now in terms of the biology can help guide some of the interventions and treatments that were discussed. So an example of that would be response to medications, right? So oftentimes, like Peter mentioned, kids come in, they have their diagnosis, but particular medication that may be the first line of treatment for that condition, like ADHD, may not work. So then it becomes a process of trial and error to try out different medications and see what works. Oftentimes, this takes a while to happen, and oftentimes there are side effects that may be associated with these medications. So if we can get more precise in terms of even recommending a starting point that may get us to a more effective treatment faster, I think that would be a goal that would be reachable within the next few years.
Terrific. There's a really excellent question here. It was mentioned that we can use the word precision in cancer therapy with mutation and then drugs and this kind of stuff. And personalization in that context makes perhaps more logical sense than, say, in concussion or neurodevelopmental disorders. But why is it that the social or psychosocial forces around the outcomes are different, more different than in cancer, for example? So Peter, you brought it up. So the social and psychosocial context of disease is much more driving, I think, in the context of the disorders we're talking about than, for example, in cancer, which is rather more biologically oriented in our treatments. There's clearly emotional issues in cancer therapy, but this is rather different.
I mean, we need to think of kids, young people, living within a family, within a neighborhood, within a school, within a community, within a city, within a province, and then within a culture. So kids are nested within a whole variety of ecosystems that will influence their development. The same is true of cancer, but in a different way. An example I like is kidney cancer. So if you have a cancer in one kidney, the probability of having cancer in the other kidney is equal to the population, even though both kidneys have the same genetic signature, the same environment, everything else is the same, but you get cancer in one kidney and not another. So that's a very circumscribed cancer of the kidney is a very circumscribed disease, which is very different than mental health problems, which are much more extensive within a whole web of influences.
All right, great. Moving on. Andrée-Anne, so especially with wearables in the context of concussion care, how specific can treatments be in the context of outcomes? Let's say, how could wearables be deployed for the management of concussion or post-concussion scenarios? Or you might want to enlarge a little bit more upon the 5P signature. How do you monitor outcomes over time?
Yeah, I'd like to discuss the wearables. That I feel like that is a very important question. We've actually done this randomized clinical trial at CHIO, which was a multi-site study, and we wanted to see when would it be possible to return to physical activity after a concussion. So we wanted to see whether children should rest after a concussion or return to physical activity at 72 hours post-injury. And the way that we did that was to give wearables to these patients, and this is where we got to understand that it is safe to return to physical activity after having a concussion. It's safe to return at 72 hours, to return to physical activity at 72 hours. And we've noticed that it would actually reduce symptoms at 2 weeks. But where I want to get with is that now we have a lot of data, and now we're actually capable of understanding with this data. So we had given acticals, which are accelerometers, which patients needed to wear for 14 consecutive days. And with this data now, we know what is the threshold. What is the threshold of moderate to vigorous physical activity from the day that they get their concussion to 14 days post-injury. And so we're able now to ameliorate the management protocols and to give more information to physician on the amount of threshold that these patients should be following. And I think this is where science is going, is to perhaps having these devices, these wearable watches, where there's where either there's a retro feedback to the patient saying, hey, you're doing too much right now. So either we program these wearables and say, okay, well, the patient should be doing this much physical activity within the next 2 weeks or within the next week, and there's feedback to the patient saying, okay, well, you're doing too much physical activity right now, or you're not doing enough physical activity, go and do physical activity. So that is where wearables are going to be useful for treating concussion.
So historically, the treatment recommendations post-concussion was to go into a dark room and sort of don't come out till you feel better kind of thing, hasn't it been?
That was true. So until before 2017, it was rest until completely asymptomatic, and afterwards you can restart doing physical activity or going back to school. And this has drastically changed in 2017, where now we state that after 24 to 48 hours, you can start back your routine of physical activity. This is not slapping back skates on and going right away on the skating rink. This is resuming slowly back to physical activity. So perhaps the first day going for a walk, the next day doing a bit more intensive physical activity.
So you're suggesting there might even be an activity prescription. Do you know, for example, whether that activity can improve outcomes?
Yes, so exactly. So the randomized clinical trial that we did does indicate that it actually helps outcome and actually help reduce symptoms at 2 weeks post-injury when we do graded physical activity. And there's actually numerous now RCTs, or randomized clinical trial, that have identified the same thing, that when you increase physical activity, not right away, but after 48 hours, you can actually reduce symptoms at 2 and 4 weeks, and you can actually prevent, in certain cases, persistent post-concussive symptom that tends to develop at 4 weeks post-injury.
Terrific. Well, as they say, exercise is medicine, right?
Exercise is medicine, yes.
The next question I'd like to address, so what advice would you give to clinicians, and this can come from either of you, about how to integrate precision medicine strategies to improve patient cares? Where do you see these tactics deployed? And I think we could put this in, and perhaps I'll ask each of you to address that. How do you see precision medicine strategies actually deployed in the context of patient care? And although, Azadeh, you're not a clinician, but you play one on TV, but you're embedded in the clinical teams, right?
I don't play one, but I definitely advise. I have a lot of advice. So we've talked a lot about precision medicine in the context of variability across individuals. But one thing that we haven't talked about, and I think is particularly helpful, especially with wearables, is variability in the experiences of the same individual over time and across different environments. So if you think about something like a difference in sensory perception, that may or may not be a disability depending on what your environmental context is, right? So in the order of minutes, you can go from that being a disability to not being a disability depending.
So I'm sorry, could you back up and just enlarge upon that more specifically? What do you mean by?
So for example, autism is associated with
Right.
Differences in sensory perception, and
yes.
this can be very distressing if you're in an environment that's not accommodating those
So a
sensory
hypersensory
differences.
environment is excessively
So for some
stimulating.
individuals it could be, and for some individuals hyposensory. So the point is that that same individual may or may not experience a disability based on that difference, depending on the environment that they're in. So I think our clinical instruments are very limited right now in terms of capturing that variability in the experiences of the same individual. We often look at longer windows, or we look at clinical observations that are limited to a few hours. So I think that's where wearables can be really helpful in terms of capturing information about how this particular child is going through their environment and experiencing, the social and environmental context. And I think my advice for clinicians would be to start considering some of those more finer-grained information in terms of how this experience is changing. So, you have the broad label. It doesn't mean that your experience is constantly the same across different environments and across
Sure,
time.
and it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all strategy.
That's right.
Peter, what would be your advice?
I was thinking that a really important activity for the clinician is to be aware of the clinical trial literature in that particular topic, that particular disorder, whether it's autism or ADHD or mood and anxiety disorder. And a lot of clinical trials do have information on what are called moderators, that is, variables that are associated with a good outcome and variables that are associated with a bad outcome. And to see across multiple clinical trials, is there consistency across those moderators, and to target those variables in order to put something extra into it. So, for example, one of the most important predictors of a poor response to depression treatments is severity of depression. And so maybe instead of everybody getting the same dose of the intervention for depression, those that have particularly severe depression get something extra. So there's an added dose to their particular treatment, whether it's a medication or more close monitoring or some more support at home or family work, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the clinical trial literature has light. There's light at the end of that tunnel in terms of the factors that predict variation in response to the treatment, a good outcome and a bad outcome. Target those and work on them in clinical practice. You can do this in your clinical practice, everyday clinical practice, in order to see whether that's helpful.
Just to touch on that for a moment, we had heard earlier that the labels for neurodevelopmental disorders in kids are less meaningful. It's certainly the same thing in the context of mental health as well, is it not? I mean, to talk about the DSM-4 large labels versus the multidimensional labels to define some of that heterogeneity. I know have those been validated going forward, or is that RDoC method to characterize mental health disorders still a work in progress?
So I'm going to try and be pleasant, but RDoC, how do I say this without using the word excrement?
Moving on to the next question.
Sorry, Tom, I'm going to get you in
But I think
trouble.
the lesson is, of course, spectrum disorders and
Yeah.
diversity. And,
Yeah,
but I think real-time turnaround of data to inform on outcomes, I think, is probably the
There are
lesson.
other ways of slicing the pie that are more empirically based rather than theoretically based, which is what RDoC was. It was a theoretical construct.
I didn't mean to bait you, but
Yeah.
we don't have to scratch that any further.
Yeah.
Andrée-Anne, as far as precision medicine strategies for the management of concussion, what have you seen? What would you recommend in the clinical practice?
like I said earlier, we're still really in the infancy of studying precision medicine in concussion. But I feel, I think what Peter said really resonated with me, is really to look through these randomized clinical trials and what have they done so far, and look exactly at those moderators and try to work with those moderators. Concussion, especially in pediatric, is really similar to mental health, as we have about 40% of our population that has a concussion that will go on having a mental health problem. And so you really need to, again, listen to the kid, listen to the child, or listen to your patient, and try to look as well at those randomized clinical trials and see what are the other moderators they can work with, exactly what Peter was saying, to try to treat the patient. So hope I answered that question.
Yeah, no, terrific. That's great. Thank you. This is actually going to be a terrific question for both the clinician and the data scientist. So what is your perspective on using a fuzzy logic approach to deal with the imprecision and uncertainty around our efforts to get these precision medicine type outcomes? Is there a potential to consider how you accommodate that heterogeneity in the context of defining disease and outcomes? So that's a good one. So the clinical perspective, because as you know, we make diagnoses based on, thumbprint syndromes, and then there's a different data science version of that. So I'd love to hear your perspective on both of those.
So I don't know a lot about fuzzy logic, but it does seem to be a very intriguing concept. I do know about error, measurement error. And I know the extent to which error is a constant companion to not only my clinical work, but to my research as well. And I think being sensitive to error, the possibility of error, and trying to minimize it as much as possible is, I think, a really important way to handle this. There are all kinds of new and interesting techniques, and Azadeh's done fantastic work, with clustering, statistical clustering, and latent profile analysis. There are all kinds of new ways that are coming out there that I think are really exciting, that will give us these data-driven subgroups that I think will have real potential, much more than theoretically driven subgroups, which have been an abject failure to now.
Yeah, as you know, the clinical oftentimes will act on the basis of our last clinical anecdote, as opposed to hard data. Yeah. But on the data science side, the rigorous way of defining categories, given the heterogeneity and imprecision, what would be your reaction?
I absolutely agree with that question. I think people are not binary. People are not zeros and ones. You don't have a diagnosis. I mean, I don't want to say this in front of a room full of clinicians, but it's not that you have a diagnosis in a binary, yes you do or no you don't. And that's what despite all the feelings towards RDoc, I like the idea of a dimensional approach. The fact that it's not a yes or a no. The fact that you can have different degrees across different dimensions of things, and these degrees can change over time depending on your experiences. So I think an approach that's not binary can definitely provide a lot more flexibility in terms of modeling the complexities that are human beings, but can also capture a lot of the impreciseness around the ways that we collect and measure data. So a lot of our clinical assessments and measurements are not crisp concepts. They're not binary yes or no. There's a lot of ambiguity around some of those. So I think an approach like that can capture some of those ambiguity, subjectivity, and uncertainty that comes with our measurement techniques as well.
Terrific, thank you. So just to change directions very slightly, I think this one has some really interesting sort of community perspective. But Andrée-Anne, how can you leverage data, for example, from 5P to then advocate for sort of care pathways or care delivery resources in the real world, in the care delivery setting? Obviously, evidence-based is pretty critical, but how might that data gathering and data utilization of risk profiling be used for managing better care in the community setting?
So for us, the way that we did it was to provide physician with a lot of knowledge translation to try to provide them, with website, with the actual data, with the actual algorithm for them to be able to collect that information within their clinic to be able to best manage their patient afterwards. Can you just elaborate again on the question?
Well, I think the idea is how data-driven strategies and risk profiling might be deployed into care, specifically to then advocate with the health system for how the care should be standardized, perhaps paid for, or offered in an equitable way across the sector.
Yeah, so, sorry, I'm trying to, nervous have just kicked in.
No, it's no problem. I think the idea, though, is that evidence-based towards the healthcare delivery sector is, I think we would all agree, the way to go, is to bring hard, validated data, but not necessarily, as they had alluded to previously, that when we make even evidence-based clinical trials, we're oftentimes not quite cherry-picking, but being fairly arbitrary in the diagnostic criteria for those patients, but it's really that real-world context. I think one of the strongest lessons for 5P is that it's deployed now really across the country in a routine care setting, and those outcomes can be delivered back to care providers and policymakers to justify a more aggressive deployment, because it's measured with outcomes and it's hard data. There's a question here that goes a little bit to the biology of neurodevelopmental disorders, and given the multidimensionality of the data that you've been involved with, imaging and connectivity analyses, is there evidence, and this is a bit esoteric in that context, but I'm sure you're going to know the answer, is neuronal growth and brain development different in folks living with a spectrum of neurodiverse disorders, or not even disorders, neurodiversity? Are there biological underpinnings, I guess, is the question.
Peter, do you want to take this? So I think I can take a step.
You
and then
take a step, okay.
Yeah. So I think the challenge with neurodevelopmental conditions like autism is that the findings have been really mixed. So of course there are studies that show there are differences in the neurobiology and various mechanisms involved, but the effect sizes are typically small, and I think this goes back to this idea of stratification, right? So we need to be able to find these subgroups where different biological mechanisms may be in place. So some of the work, for example, that's coming out of POND is looking at various genetics differences that then may map onto differences in brain and neurobiology.
I mean, I would add that there have been some replicated sort of structural and functional changes in people with autism. Surprisingly, you see similar things in kids with ADHD and autism, which sort of, again, speaks to this crossing of barriers. I think the effect sizes are small and they're difficult to replicate. But I do think there are some things that seem to be hanging together coherently over the last number of years. Brain volume, for example, connectivity, excitatory, inhibitory balance, things like that.
Yeah, we see the same as well in concussion. Small effect sizes, but differences in terms of connectivity, functional connectivity, structural volume of gray matter as well. But it's always really small effect sizes when we compare them to orthopedic injuries.
Terrific. This is a really interesting question, is that obviously we've talked a lot about the overlap, thinking about concussion and mental health disorders in particular. The question is, are general practitioners and clinicians trained to watch for these mental health conditions in this kind of at-risk population? And are there tools that might be used to maybe flag those that might be at higher risk, not necessarily just from poor clinical outcomes, but perhaps predisposition towards mental health disorder? Are you aware of that?
Yes, that is a great question. And so mental health has only really started to be researched in concussion, and there's just recently a paper that came out into JAMA Opens that really looked at the Ontario population to see whether mental health was an outcome after a concussion, and it is. And so based on this paper now, we do recommend to all clinicians to really screen for mental health when a patient comes and sees them, and screen for upon the first session with them, and when they come back at their second week assessment as well. And if we go onto pedsconcussion.com, this is our pediatric concussion guidelines that we have created at CHEO. and it's for the Ontario population. We do have mental health guidelines, and we do also have mental health questionnaires to help clinicians to help them diagnose or help them give the best information to their patients.
Terrific.
And to help them screen as well, the patients. Sorry.
Excellent. So we got a couple of tech-oriented questions, and this one's going to be really interesting, and surely, Azadeh, you're going to have something to say. So ChatGPT, all in the news these days, has earned over actually 100 million users in the initial several months, and people are using it as kind of a support method, or at least for some medical advice, sometimes even to inform their own thoughts and really taking for what they're providing for gospel. And the question is, are you aware of any strategies using things like these large language models for clinical use? And what might these strategies hold for the management of brain disorders or the mental health disorders we're talking about? I think there has been some work with chatbots already in the context of remote mental health, and some people actually engage with them in a more preferential way. They seem to trust them a little bit better sometimes. But I don't know if you have some personal thoughts about where you think that technology might be headed.
For sure. So the technology itself, I think we're very close to having something that can actually provide meaningful recommendations to obviously complement clinical decision making. Having said that, using technology in a clinical setting is very multidimensional. So it's one thing for the technology to actually work. It's another thing for people to actually use it in their decision making. So I think the big challenge that we're going to see with a lot of these AI-based technologies would be around issues of acceptability, trust, ethics, and all these other issues that come into play when you start to implement some of these technologies. And I think this is where it's really important for us to start co-creating these technologies with the communities that we serve, but also with clinicians and the people who actually have to use these technologies for decision making.
Terrific. Are either of the other of you aware of the application of either of these?
In my field, the applications aren't being used right now, or we haven't started. I do see, however, the potential of using AI eventually to try to really, parselate what are the best symptoms to try to diagnose, for instance, a patient, or try to prognosticate better a patient, for sure. But I do think with ChatGPT, there is a lot of ethical issues, and we do need to be really careful with it. In their first iteration, ChatGPT did mention that the patient or that the client should commit suicide. So right now, we are not there at using ChatGPT.
No, I think the validation, people are typically in their trust or their curiosity much further ahead than they ought to be, frankly, as far as the safety, because it's really not informed, it's really not intelligent, it's just using statistics and things like that. So, but I think people are loath to have that insight. It's almost entertained in the context, and then going towards getting actually information for their care. And of course, any model is only as good as the data on which it's trained. I think, however, it would behoove us to think about the health delivery system and the masses of multidimensional data that are out there to see, are there techniques and strategies that can help us learn in the computing sense of that term, and then validate in the clinical care piece. And I think that would be a very interesting application of this famous learning health system context. And I think we'd probably all agree with that. Any other comments on ChatGPT?
The closest analogy in my field is internet-based CBT. And you can have internet-based CBT that is the exact opposite of precision. In other words, it's one program, and it's just delivered by I don't know, is it a robot or a whatever? It's just delivered as it were. And I think the evidence is that internet-based CBT without a coach is no better than placebo, is no better than doing nothing. So that tells me a lot, that you do need a human dimension to the psychosocial intervention for it to be effective.
Now, I guess it's whether it's quote-unquote human or literally human, right? So because a lot of the adaptable methodologies, in fact, may come to be sort of human or nearly human, I suppose.
It brings up all kinds of ethical
Oh, no, of course it does.
issues and things like that.
I was just intrigued to hear that, in fact, that the trust in things like chatbots and some of this automated technology seems to be even greater uptake for maybe if it's privacy or personal embarrassment. I'm not sure what it is, but the engagement is meant to be fairly fulsome with those platforms. So that's perhaps something to learn from. It's not obviously finished yet. Now, there are some high-tech therapeutic strategies that are out there, and everyone has heard of things like CRISPR and some of these other highly novel gene editing techniques and technologies. These are ways of actually getting down to the DNA level and using molecular scissors to go to specific sites of mutation and fix them. And they are really quite remarkable in those scenarios. However, the number of disorders, even theoretically, that could be impacted are those that are, single gene disorders that are a result of one letter switch. More complex than that, there certainly are some examples in the experimental literature, but none of these have been deployed clinically, save for things like bone marrow transplant and sickle cell disease. But really interesting proofs of principle. I presume most of you would agree that we're not quite ready for prime time for gene editing in the context of mental health. I think, however, the molecular underpinnings are becoming better and better known, and as the tools develop at the same time with the context, we may come to a day where there might be molecular interventions. I mean, pharmaceutical drugs are molecular interventions in a certain sense, coarse though they might be. Do you have any reaction to sort of more in the context of precision medicine, kind of molecular specific approaches? We've talked a lot about sort of gene testing and things like that. And again, these are not single gene disorders, and that might be another layer of complexity, but genetic-based or genomic level intervention.
But I don't think we should forget that a substantial proportion of people with autism do have single gene disorders, tuberous sclerosis, Fragile X, neurofibromatosis. So although each of them is individually rare, collectively it's not uncommon. And maybe in those cases where autism is associated with a single gene disorder, there really is some very interesting potential in order to try that. There are questions about how you would identify and when you would do it, and et cetera, but it is an intrigue, to me it's an intriguing possibility.
I think also, just to add to that, I think in many neurodevelopmental conditions, the focus is on reducing distress and disability as opposed to, fixing the actual person. So I think we need to identify what those points of distress and disability are that are of importance to the community, and then start to look at those aspects specifically.
Right, so there is biology, but there's also context.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Certainly true, and I think you'd probably say the same thing in the molecular intervention, even in head injury. Although it might be a not genetic predisposed condition, there are molecular signals and cascades of consequence.
Oh, there is definitely a biocascade of consequences after a concussion, but to say we would be able to use CRISPR, for instance, or something similar in concussion, I'm not sure if we would go there. We would probably use more of a drug to try to inhibit that biological cascade of events,
it's like a neuroprotection strategy, even pharmaceutical. No, quite right. Right, that's really interesting. All right, and thank you. All right. I wonder, maybe we could get a little specific once more about do biomarkers actually exist for mental health illnesses like they do for these cancers? And is there any advantage to the screening strategies? As you know, in cancer, there are even blood tests now for screening for cancer, either predisposition or actually occurrence of cancer. Might these be available for mental health? Are you aware of specific biomarkers that might be used for risk screening as opposed to, say, therapeutic intervention? I'm not personally aware of that.
To me, the best evidence comes from inflammatory markers, and the relationship between inflammatory markers and, say, depression and cardiovascular disease. There is a relationship between inflammatory markers and those two health conditions, depression and cardiovascular disease. I don't think we understand the relationship, whether it's a reciprocal relationship or a one-way relationship. but inflammatory markers are an intriguing biomarker for mental health that might have multiple impacts. It might be pleiotropic, as it were. So I think biomarkers is interesting. I think the microbiome is another one that's really interesting. I was very skeptical about the microbiome as a field of study, but
Could you just do a little bit of what you mean about microbiome?
So the microbiome refers to the bacteria in your gut, your mouth, intestinal system, etc. And kids with, can go through a number of different experiences that alters their microbiome. Being born by cesarean section, for example, as opposed to a vaginal delivery, will have a big impact on what your microbiome is. And we know there's a very close relationship between the gut and neurochemicals released in the gut and your brain. That we know from animal and human studies. Now, what's the relationship between the microbiome and mental health? It's an emerging area. I am now more convinced it's worth pursuing at this point. And it does lead to the possibility of probiotics being an adjunct treatment for anxiety or depression, for example. I think in autism, there's been quite a few clinical trials of fecal transplants, for example, or probiotics in autism, treating some of the symptoms. So I think there's some there, and I think it's worth pursuing.
That's really interesting. I've been aware that there is an association between the gut-brain axis, as they call it, through actually neurochemicals that go from the digestive system through the circulation to brain that have an impact on brain function. Yeah. So obviously that type of research is going to be rife with possibility as far as the interventions go. Interesting. So I've got a really terrific question in general before we ask you guys for your kind of closing comments. But what does this mean for me as an individual? The writer says, how can my doctor and other professional caregivers gather enough information about me and my health to prescribe the best course of treatment? And I think this is critical not just for a person who's living with a brain disorder herself, but maybe in the broader context of general health and how we live and thrive with brain health is our mantra as far as primary focus for good healthy living. How would you suggest that the clinical or maybe medical system or maybe medical/community system gather information on an ongoing basis to kind of optimize well-being? So let's take a little bit away from the context of mental health and think about what is an idea about data-driven strategies in the context of brain health. Let's just start with that. Do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I feel that learning systems are going to evolve, and we're going to start having common data elements among all the clinics, and the clinics will be perhaps able to talk among each other. And this is how that individual or anybody here in the room will be able to see the direct impact on their health, because we're going to have all this data being collected. And perhaps when we refine these algorithms to understand if someone will be at risk of developing, for instance, persistent post-concussive symptoms or some sort of mental health disorder, the data will be there. The clinician will be able to access with a click of a button the algorithm and understand what precision health or precision medicine they should be giving, or management they should be giving to that patient. So I do feel common data elements are the way to go.
Terrific. Azadeh?
So as an engineer, I often talk about how all these promises play out in the real world, right? So yes, there's a lot of promise to big data. There's a lot of promise in collecting data from everyone all the time and using all of this data to deliver the perfect model of care. But the truth is there are also risks, right? So I think it all comes down to an individual choice at the end of the day for that particular person, this balance between risks and benefits of being profiled all the time versus being delivered the type of care that you would require. So at the end of the day, I think there'll be a lot of human factors that will play out in this, both from the clinicians who will have to use these systems to augment their decision making, but also from the users who are providing all of this data and then end up receiving the care that's based on all of these artificial intelligence and algorithms. So.
Right. I think that's a really good point. We talk about the idea of digital exhaust even for routine care for your purchasing and your location in your car that is nowhere where's you're headed. So there is that. I think there's the optimistic side that is used for your betterment in healthcare and modeling that. I think the other important point is the diversity of data that may well inform. It's not all about the blood tests and the scales you have in the office, but perhaps general health and activity, for example, as you brought up earlier. Peter?
I've been really struck by the research on the prevention of dementia. So the prevention of dementia basically focuses on the social determinants of health. To prevent dementia, exercise, have a good diet, don't be lonely, right? Cognitive stimulation, and don't get depressed. Those are the social determinants of health for something as organic as dementia. And the same thing goes for cardiovascular health. So to me, a big part of the secret is physicians and the healthcare system paying attention to the social determinants of health, and also the system, the social safety net, etc., paying attention to the social determinants of health and supporting those who are marginalized for one reason or another.
Right. Again, biology and context.
Yeah.
They talk about prevention and provention, and I think that's absolutely correct. So I think we're going to begin to tie it up. So I might ask each one of you to think about what type of lessons you would like to tell the audience about for the conversation from this evening from your own personal points of view. I just want to say the range and breadth of topics I think we were able to cover is pretty impressive, right from mental health disorders to depression to biology and et cetera. So I think hopefully that's appreciated by the audience. But Andrée-Anne, let me perhaps start with you. Is what kind of message would you like the audience to take away from the conversation we had this evening?
Yeah, I think it goes back to my first sentence that precision medicine and precision health is still in its infancy in concussion, but we are working really hard at trying to make it and understand it to best diagnose a concussion, because right now we don't actually have biomarkers to diagnose a concussion, but as well better prognosticate, and to better manage patients with a concussion. So we are still in its infancy and we are working towards it. The only way that we can work towards it is with the participation of the public, the participation of our patients as well. And so patient engagement becomes very important for us. They help us understand what are the other questions that we should be asking to research, but as well they participate into our study. So I'd like to thank you for patient engagement as well.
Terrific, thank you. Azadeh.
So, we talked a lot about the potential of precision medicine, and I'm really hopeful about this potential. But I think to ensure that this is realized in sort of a new model of care, we definitely need a lot of multidisciplinary teamwork, involving the communities that we serve, engineers, clinicians, educators, to ensure that at the end of the day, we come out with a system that is usable, accepted by everyone, and a system that can actually provide care that's equitable and respectful of people's individualities.
Terrific, thank you. And Peter?
So I'm old, as you mentioned, more than 40 years in the system working, and I've seen many revolutions come and go. And the disappointment in the wake of the failure of a revolution, whether it's the neurochemical hypothesis, whether it's serotonin, dopamine, I don't care what, has negative consequences. And I have a lot of optimism about this precision, personalized medicine, but I do think we need to go slow. We mustn't overpromise. We must be humble, and we must do the hard, slogging work to do the research to back up the promises and the hopes that we all have to improve outcomes for everybody with brain disorders and mental health challenges.
Terrific. As they say, the plural of anecdote is not data. question for me. How does precision medicine help brain health care system, basically? Yeah. So, yeah, thanks for the opportunity to weigh in here sort of at the very end. But I echo all the sentiment that you've provided. I think we're all very driven by the context of disorder, that these are not necessarily all diseases in the conventional sense. I think what we're doing is looking at strategies to help people thrive in the real world. And ideally, the interventions ought to be evidence-based, generalizable as much as possible, and customized as much as necessary. So I think these are strategies that we're working very hard to try to deploy, try to measure, and as we make important decisions about where healthcare dollars, for example, are sent, we want to make sure we're generating value into this sector, and value is measured by the customer, by the person living with a brain disorder, and their caregivers and families. So I want to thank each of the panelists, Andrée-Anne, Azadeh, and Peter, for sharing the expertise with us today. I thought it was a tremendous session. We want to thank the audience for a long list of questions, and hopefully they were answered to your satisfaction. We're happy to continue to engage in that conversation. And there are a number of resources around this topic that we're going to put on the screen so that you can access. The other thing is your feedback is always critically important, and we want your feedback in the chat box online, and if you're joining us here in person, please provide that feedback to us either directly or in writing. These public talks are designed to share the latest knowledge in this larger context of brain health, and there are a number of important tips that go on for the management of brain health. We have another series coming up, which is actually called Brain Health Basics, and it's going to explore the importance and impact of everyday things such as sleep, activity, and nutrition, and we heard much of that today for the maintenance of brain health in the population. And this is not simply a disease orientation, this is for our general thriving of normal health. The first talk is going to be called Movement in Brain Health, and I think it'll be a tremendous series. And hopefully you all will feel the same. So I'd like to welcome any participants to a reception next door, and otherwise join me in thanking the participants of our panel, and thank you for coming.